Hey everyone, Shane Stevenson here again, Curator and Museum Collections Director here at the Buffalo Naval Park. And for today's video, we've got Ryan again, we've got Lucas here, and we are in the conning tower of the USS Croaker. It's not a space that is very viewable to our visitors, and there's been a lot of cannibalization here in this space. So if you were to ever visit the cod or the drum, the cobia, they are much more intact than we are here. And so Lucas will talk to you a little bit about what's available and what we still can see archaeologically. So a little bit, and if you're a fan of our channel, you'll know that I talk pretty incessantly about our 1953 conversion to a Type II SSK. So we looked like the cod, we looked like the cobia, we looked like the drum, but now we look like the Kavala, 244 down in Texas, and 246 Croaker here in Buffalo. We are the last two from the Gatos that are still in SSK conversion. Began in 1953, submarines were taking on a different role than in World War II, and we were pretty stunned by the growth of the Russian submarine fleet and the Russian merchant fleet and capital fleet. And so they said, let's convert, it ended up being fewer than 10 Gato classes, but let's convert some with more updated technology and certainly to quiet the boat a little bit more. And in 1953, that's what they did. The ship came back into service in 51, spent 2 years being converted into a hunter-killer. So at that time, these boats that went through the SSKs were literally the quietest boats in the U.S. Navy and in the U.S. Submarine Force. What we would do is we would kind of park ourselves. We had a lot of passive sonar on board. The BQR-3, the BQR-4, and we would just park ourselves out at, off an inlet, 100 feet, 150 feet below the surface, and we would just listen from that BQR-4 with the transducers in the bow. So now you're not being interrupted by anything that's going on the submarine itself or on the boat itself. You are now shooting out the BQR-4 passive array and just soaking in all of those sounds. And then our new sonar room, which was also converted in 1953, has the sonarmen guys listening down there. So some of those changes were certainly the subsail surrounding the conning tower here, right? You come here, it's huge, as opposed to the more fair weather bridges that you'd see on the cobia or the cod, and lower, and much more exposed to the elements. They removed 2 of the forward torpedo tubes, all right, for the transducers, the BQR-4s. So we have 8 torpedo tubes in our configuration as opposed to 10. They removed 1 of the engines, right? That was to help quiet the boat. They realized that they can get away with charging the batteries and having 1 less engine on board. And so those are some of the major changes that happened to the SSK. I've also done other videos about SSK conversion, so you can watch those, and maybe I'll link those under this video. By 1959, SSKs had been passed by, not only by U.S. submarine force, but also the Russian submarine force. So they did their SSK work from 53 to 59, and then they went back to just fleet submarine duty, redesignated as SS-246 instead of SSK-246. She went out of service in 68. All right, she was out of service in reserve until 1971. And there's an interesting piece of information that none of us really knew until fairly recently, that I read an article in a newspaper that was talking to a captain who was the chief engineer of Submarine Squadron 2 in Groton, Connecticut. And in this article that he says, and I have my notes here just to be sure, he says they went on a strip trip All right, but as Submarine Squadron 2, it wasn't just a singular event like we would do today. They had access to the ex-USS Carp, SS-338, and here we go, the ex-USS Croaker, SS-246. And what they said was, we used temporary duty and medical hold submarine sailors to man and manage the strip trip operation. We took over a warehouse on the submarine base to store and inventory the spare parts. Some of the items were removed from the submarines, but most of the items remained on the ships until a need was identified. So they came on board the Croaker, identified things that they could use spare parts for, and either removed them at the time or probably tagged them for later removal. And so as Lucas begins to explain some stuff around the conning tower here, you will see that there's a lot of stripped parts. And we have had potentially 3 times that the Croaker could have been stripped. Certainly this is a new one from 1970, right, where Submarine Squadron 2 just had access to the Carp and the Croaker as their own personal strip trip boats. Certainly when the ship was out of service completely in 1971, there could have been some cannibalization then. And then, of course, she opens up in 1977 as a museum ship in Groton. And she was open for 10 years. So people could have been coming on board. So unlike other boats that probably just get parked along a pier side and they turn into museum ships immediately, the Croaker had a lot of activity after 1968 until she arrived 20 years later in Buffalo in 1988. So there's a lot of stuff that we don't have provenance for, why things were stripped. So that's a little of the background. And now Ryan will turn it over to Lucas, and we'll talk about some of the things we do see remaining and what's potentially missing in the conning tower.
Yeah, so up forward here, we can see that most of this looks kind of intact. I mean, we're missing dials and switches for these panels, but we have the rudder angle to tell you where the rudder's pointing. The steering mount is still here, but the wheel is probably an after addition, either from Groton when she was a museum there, or from here at the Naval Park. Then we have a compass to give you your bearing, and a speedometer and what looks like an odometer here. The ladder to get up to the bridge, and then right here is some kind of sonar machine, the azimuth recorder. I'm not entirely sure what this is for, but if you know, please let us know.
So usually with an azimuth, it's the angle of the surface to the actual target, and then that angle becomes the azimuth. So my thinking is it might be like a height finder for a surface target. You know, how deep it is in the water. I mean, of course, we did have a bomb, an aerial bomb dropped on us. So maybe, you know, it could be part of the surface search radar as well, because we did have a surface and air search radar coming through the top of the conning tower. So the azimuth, we know, is that angle of something at a certain height against a flat surface, or the one axis, all right? And so that may have been something to do with that. If you take a look here, there's always the attacking periscope and the cruising periscope, all right? Obviously, just totally cannibalized. We don't even have the tube coming down here. We have some makeshift tube here, probably just to have people view it from down below. One of the things that we'd like to cover here is the odyssey of Croaker's attack periscope. So I've been told by guys that were in Groton and New London, Connecticut, that the Croaker periscope, probably the attack periscope, was just sitting in a restaurant parking lot. Now, I've probably covered this in other videos as well, but people would come to me and say, hey, we think the Croaker periscope is in the Puffin's restaurant, right there, right next to the dock. They just removed it, threw it in the grass, and there it sits even to this day. Very excited, talked to some of the individuals around here, and we said, let's go on a trip. I called the restaurant. I said, we think the periscope is there for our boat. Do you mind if we would come and pick it up? He said, no, please feel free. We never even knew that it was there. And so we did a little more, someone who lives in the area did a little more research. It's already been cut in half. So unfortunately, all of the optics have been removed. And so therefore I said, you know what? If it's just the tube, just let it lie. Now, as you saw with Lucas, he's covered kind of the front end of the conning tower, the steering spaces, and the other equipment that he's talked about. One of the things that again could have been taken in 70, could have been taken in that gap from 71 after final being struck from the National Register and opening in 1977 as a museum ship, is unfortunately the torpedo data computer is missing. You can see the mount for it right down there. It was a pretty narrow computer, and it would have been up to the top mount that you can see probably right there. Something somewhere similar around there. There was like a navigation chart table. You can see the mounting for that as well. There would have been a guy sitting here. Of course, the two periscopes, attack and cruising periscope. But again, it's been all cannibalized, and we don't know with this new edition of the 1970, which none of us, I believe, knew that it was just kind of there for Submarine Squadron 2 in Groton. Some of the back, there's also missing pieces and parts and valves and switches missing. This is kind of a mystery here. I'd love to do more work. I don't see any stamp on it, serial numbers, anything like that, but this would be something that seems to be a button depression here. So, and what was just stored up here potentially, ex post facto, after the ship went into museum service, museum ship service, maybe they just started storing stuff up here. And so there's a lot of degradation and confusion. We've pointed out some of the things that would have been here that are now not. Don't know the dates. So this space is a little disappointing, Lucas, I think. And it's disappointing not just from an archaeological standpoint, but it's disappointing from a curatorial standpoint too. It's just those years of being stripped and cannibalized without much of provenance or records being left in our collections. And I looked through our Croaker manuscript collections that I've processed so far, and there's just nothing that I can find on it. For the next video though, we're gonna head up the ladder, and we will be on the outside within the subsail itself, and that will be pretty interesting and exciting. Lucas?
Yep.
Yep. Have a good, thanks for joining us as always, and we'll see you again soon.